Hi Cyber Class, it's Professor Opterbeck and welcome to week 2 of our class. I enjoyed reading your posts from last week, and as you see, last week we really just got into the question of the US cyber strategy for national security purposes. And we're going to dig further into that this week by looking into some of the law of US national security, particularly the law of war. Now, this is the US constitutional law of war. We will look at the international law of war next week. And there's a constitutional issue in the law of war relating to separation of powers. Congress has the power to declare war. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Well, what do we do if U.S. armed forces are going to be committed abroad short of a declaration of war? And this is a problem we've really faced since the Korean conflict, and it became really acute after the Vietnam conflict. And after Vietnam, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which is an effort to at least clarify some of the ambiguities when the U.S. is going to deploy troops short of a declaration of war. So a lot of the materials this week focus on the War Powers Resolution. And as you'll see from these materials, the War Powers Resolution constitutionally is ambiguous. It very well may be unconstitutional. And the problem here is really the problem of a legislative veto. So I gave you INS v. Chadha to look at, which is the legislative veto case. I gave you Campbell v. Clinton, which is a challenge to President Clinton's actions in Bosnia that was addressed in the DC circuit, but not definitively, and never made its way up to the Supreme Court. And so really the status of the WPR is still up in the air, and it's something you want to think about. It's particularly challenging, I think, in cyber, because as you have seen, part of the US strategy in cyberspace is a strategy of defending forward. And defending forward means, of course, we're going to have our firewalls and our cyber hygiene and all those things trying to deal with intrusions into our cyberspace. But we are also actively hacking and looking for entities and persons that might be looking to disrupt our cyberspace and trying to disrupt them, in a sense, preemptively. And that includes not just sort of individual cyber criminals. It includes organized cybercrime groups that are connected with nation states, particularly in the RBOC countries and the Russian-speaking countries. And it includes nation-state actors themselves, both in Russia and in China and in North Korea, as well as in other places. So, you know, the question to think about this week is the kind of constitutional structure around and really authority for this kind of cyber operation, and the extent to which cyberspace here really is stretching kind of constitutional norms and even really ideas about the nation state, maybe a little bit to their breaking point. As I said, next week we're going to look at the international law of war, and we will further see how the norms about international law, both in the start of war, which is called jus ad bellum, and the action within war, which is called jus in bello, get challenged also by cyberspace and cyber war, cyber conflict. I gave you a couple papers of mine to look at this week. They weren't in the syllabus. They should have been, but they're online. If you're short for time, focus on the drone courts paper this week. Both of these papers are really already a little bit dated at this point, but you know, you'll see in the drone courts, I'm dealing with what we might call kind of the more traditional drone warfare, if we can use that term, which are, you know, the Predator and Reaper type drones shooting missiles. I gave you one video to look at which talks a little bit about some emerging uses of military drones, which are really much smaller, kind of the idea of a drone swarm. I've also seen proposals that relate to sort of very small individual drones, maybe even the size of a bird, maybe even the size of an insect, that could be used for targeted killings, in other words, for assassinations. Things along those lines, you know, further push those boundaries. It's really the Internet of Things and the Internet of military things. And especially as artificial intelligence gets involved and these weapon systems become more and more autonomous. So think a bit about what kind of norms we want to be thinking about, what kind of law we want to be thinking about for this week in the U.S. national security context. In other words, when is it authorized for the U.S., for the executive, for the president to put forward, to order such actions? Next week we'll look at international law. So I look forward to discussing this with you online.